I need to create a historically grounded cinematic script about Messalina's alleged sex contest. Let me craft a YouTube script that opens with visceral immersion, maintains high retention through curiosity spikes, and delivers emotional depth while being historically responsible. You feel the marble cold beneath your palms. The corridor reeks of perfumed oil and something darker: sweat, wine, the metallic edge of fear. Voices drift through silk curtains ahead, laughter that doesn't quite reach joy. You shouldn't be here, pressed against this column in the pre-dawn shadows of the Palatine Hill. But the Empress herself passed through these halls an hour ago, cloaked and hooded, moving like a thief through her own palace. Your pulse hammers. In Rome, knowing too much is a sentence written in blood. Before we step deeper into this world of marble and shadows, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from? It amazes me that we can explore these ancient Roman streets together, you and I, separated by centuries from them but connected to each other across every time zone and border. This is Rome, 48 AD. The empire stretches from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Judea, and at its heart sits a woman whose name will become synonymous with transgression. Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of the heir Britannicus, the most powerful woman in the known world. Within months, she'll be dead in a garden, her statues shattered, her name chiseled from monuments as if she never existed. The Senate will decree damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory itself. But memory is stubborn. The historians Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Juvenal preserved something about her that reads less like history and more like fever dream. That the Empress of Rome, dressed as a common prostitute, worked through the night in the brothels of the Subura. That she challenged Rome's most notorious prostitute to a contest of endurance. That she won. The question isn't whether Messalina was scandalous. The question is, in a city where emperors routinely murdered their way to power, where slaves were property and cruelty was entertainment, why did her sexuality become the scandal that history couldn't forget? Valeria Messalina entered the world around 20 AD with every advantage Rome could offer. Her father's family traced their lineage to Republican heroes whose waxed death masks lined the family atrium, watching over the living with hollow eyes. Her mother was sister to Nero's father, cousin to Caligula. From childhood, she breathed the rarefied air of the Palatine Hill, where politicians and gods seemed equally real and equally dangerous. Roman girls of her class didn't have childhoods as we'd recognize them. They had preparations. By age 12, Messalina would have understood that her body, her fertility, her family name were all tools in the empire's endless chess game. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about alliances, about weaving bloodlines into unbreakable nets of power. At perhaps 18, she married Claudius. He was 48, limping, stammering, mocked by the very senators he'd someday rule. Claudius had survived the Julio-Claudian bloodbath by pretending to be less dangerous than he was, burying himself in scholarship while his relatives murdered each other for the throne. The wedding was spectacle. Incense thick enough to choke on, silk canopies, senators whispering their calculations behind false smiles. Messalina bore him 2 children, Claudia Octavia in 39 or 40 AD, delicate and dark-eyed, Britannicus in 41 AD, named for his father's coming conquest of Britain. That same year, everything changed. Praetorian guardsmen found Caligula in a palace corridor, his body opened by daggers, his blood spreading across mosaic floors depicting pastoral scenes that suddenly seemed obscene. They found Claudius hiding behind a curtain, dragged him out, and proclaimed him emperor before the Senate could blink. Overnight, Messalina, barely into her 20s, became empress. The palace that opened to her was both paradise and labyrinth. Marble halls reflected torchlight like captured stars. Frescoes showed gods in eternal repose. Fountains sang in courtyards where rose petals floated on water that traveled miles through lead pipes to reach this hill. But the air always carried something else. Whispers, suspicion, the cold mathematics of survival. She learned quickly. Claudius, for all his scholarship, relied heavily on his freedmen, former slaves who'd risen to positions of staggering influence. Narcissus, whose eyes missed nothing. Pallas, wealthier than most senators. These men drafted edicts, managed provinces, and whispered in the emperor's ear. Messalina cultivated them, understanding what her husband sometimes forgot. In Rome, information was sharper than any blade. The first accusations come to us from Tacitus. In 42 AD, Messalina turned her attention to Appius Junius Silanus, a senator she'd arranged to marry her own mother. When Silanus refused her advances, whether real or invented by Tacitus, we'll never know for certain, she wove a story of treason. The historian describes Claudius roused from sleep by Narcissus, his face pale in lamplight, signing a death warrant without investigation. Silanus died at dawn on the Gemonian steps, that grim staircase where traitors' bodies were displayed for Rome to see. Was it true? The sources we have were written by men who despised her, during reigns that needed to contrast their virtue against her vice. But something happened. Silanus died. Others followed. Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, exiled to Pandateria in 41 AD, where letters smuggled by loyal slaves spoke of hunger, of wind that never stopped, of slow death under an indifferent sun. And then there are the stories that seem designed to scandalize, to titillate, to reduce a complex political figure to pure appetite. Juvenal's satires, written decades later, describe the empress slipping out of the palace at night, disguised as Lysiska, a prostitute's name, to work in brothels where straw pallets scratched skin and oil lamps smoked. She wore a hooded cloak, Juvenal claimed, but couldn't conceal the hunger in her eyes. She returned at dawn, coal-smudged and exhausted, yet still unsatisfied. Pliny the Elder took the story further. He wrote of a contest in 48 AD between Messalina and Sylla, a prostitute famous throughout Rome for her stamina. The challenge: who could bed more men in a single day and night? Messalina won, Pliny claimed, servicing 25 men before Sylla conceded defeat. The image is lurid, shocking, almost pornographic in its detail. It's also almost certainly false, or at least wildly exaggerated. Tacitus himself, no friend to Messalina, noted that many stories about her were amplified by Agrippina's memoirs, written by her successor who had every reason to blacken her name. Juvenal was a satirist, not a historian, writing for an audience that enjoyed moral outrage as entertainment. But here's what's fascinating. Even if the contest never happened, Rome believed it could have. In a city where Tiberius kept young boys on Capri for his pleasure, where Caligula declared himself a living god and committed incest with his sisters, where Nero would later castrate a boy named Sporus and marry him in a public ceremony. Why was Messalina's sexuality the transgression that history obsessed over? Perhaps because she was a woman claiming the same license that emperors took as their right. Roman men could visit brothels, keep concubines, exploit slaves of any age or gender. It was so normalized that Pliny could casually mention the sexual use of young enslaved boys in his natural history, as if commenting on the weather. But an empress doing the same? That violated something deeper than law. It violated the social fiction that women were passive vessels of family honor. Messalina was also a mother. The sources tell us this grudgingly between scandals. Britannicus played in palace gardens, chasing lizards under laurel trees, loved by a father who saw himself in the bookish boy. Octavia was groomed for dynastic marriage, quiet and careful, watching her mother navigate shark-infested waters. When Claudius left Rome in 43 AD to personally lead the conquest of Britain, wading through muddy marshes to plant imperial standards in the rain, he left Messalina in charge. That wasn't scandal. That was trust. Her unraveling began with Gaius Silius, consul designate for 48 AD, young, ambitious, handsome in the way that turned heads in the Forum. Tacitus describes an affair conducted in the open, meetings in villas where ivy climbed columns and bodies tangled on couches scattered with rose petals. But it wasn't just desire. Silius whispered of power, of possibilities. With Claudius aging and distracted, perhaps a new dynasty could begin. While Claudius inspected grain ships at Ostia, watching Mediterranean waves shimmer like hammered bronze, Messalina and Silius staged a wedding ceremony. The details read like bacchanalian madness. Guests draped in grapevines, flutes trilling, the bride's veil fluttering as she laughed with something that looked like freedom. Was it a marriage or a ritual? A coup attempt or reckless symbolism? Even Tacitus seems uncertain. Narcissus wasn't. The freedman rode to Ostia in a chariot that kicked up dust for miles, bringing word of treason. Claudius returned under cover of darkness, the wheels of his carriage jolting over uneven roads, betrayal hardening his scholar's face into something colder. The end came swiftly. Praetorians stormed Silius's house, finding imperial treasures, gifts from Messalina, scattered among wine goblets and wilted flowers. Silius died without trial. Others followed. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, where cypress trees swayed like mourners and paths once walked for pleasure became her final maze. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, met her there. In the most human moment recorded by Tacitus, Lepida pressed a dagger into her daughter's hands, urging the suicide that might save the family name. Messalina hesitated. Tears streamed. The blade trembled. Grass pressed cold against her knees. She couldn't do it. A tribune's sword finished what she couldn't begin. Her blood soaked into earth where nightingales sang. Later that evening, dining, Claudius asked why the empress hadn't joined him. Whether from genuine confusion or deliberate cruelty, the historian doesn't say. His voice was empty of warmth, as if grief had carved out everything soft and left only stone. The Senate moved with practiced efficiency. Damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. Statues toppled, their crashes echoing through empty plazas. Her name was chiseled from inscriptions, leaving blank spaces in marble like missing teeth. Her children's mother became a void, an absence, a cautionary tale scratched in the margins of other people's histories. But even in death she was useful. Each subsequent empress could be measured against Messalina's alleged depravity. Each emperor could gesture at her memory and promise his wife wouldn't be like that. She became myth more than woman. Her actual political maneuverings, the alliances built, the threats managed, the empire administered while her husband studied in his library, lost beneath layers of sexual scandal, what remains in the ash and rumor. Perhaps a young woman thrust into impossible power, playing by rules written to ensure she'd lose. Perhaps a genuine political threat who understood that in Rome, sex was never just sex. It was currency, weapon, message. Perhaps simply someone who wanted what emperors took without question and found that wanting, when done by a woman, became the scandal that eclipsed all others. The fires have long since gone cold on the Palatine Hill. The brothels of the Subura are buried under centuries of Roman lives. Messalina's bones are dust, her statues fragments, her name a footnote explaining why subsequent empresses needed to be carefully monitored. But the story persists, changing shape with each telling, a mirror that reflects our assumptions about power and gender and the dangerous possibilities of female desire. And in that persistence perhaps lies the real contest Messalina won. Not against a prostitute named Scylla in some lurid competition, but against damnatio memoriae itself, the empire's ultimate punishment, the erasure that should have made her disappear. 2,000 years later, we're still speaking her name, still trying to separate the woman from the myth, still asking questions that Roman senators wanted silenced forever. The marble is cold. The curtains have stopped moving. Dawn is breaking over the Tiber, painting the river gold, and somewhere in the palace, a servant is scrubbing blood from garden stones. History will write this in ink and judgment, but the questions remain, suspended in the Roman air like incense that never quite clears. What power was she really reaching for? What did Rome need to believe about her to justify what came next? And in the space between what she did and what they said she did, there in the gap where truth goes to die, what gets lost besides the woman herself? The sun rises. The empire continues. The story, like all good scandals, refuses to end.